using a palette knife on a painting. What you are doing is taking whatever color you have mixed from your palette, and it's almost as if you're icing a cake. I'm gonna apply my paint to my painting. You know what? When you're applying it, you're kind of deciding a pattern, so to speak. You are moving your hand and making motions with your hand that will create texture. So in this case, while I'm using my palette knife for the shadow areas, I'm not only wiping it on there, but I'm kind of shaking my hand a little bit, and it's creating some texture in there. So what you're doing is experimenting. You probably will be feeling really uncomfortable the first time you do this. Don't worry about it. This is meant to be fun. Okay? And look at that big blob on my painting. Am I worried about it? Not at all. It's just a piece of paper and I'm gonna cover it up. Lots and lots of layers of paint. So no problem. If you want to try using a palette knife, wonderful. If you're not comfortable, that's fine too. Next, I'm gonna make some different tints and shades of my purple. So I'm gonna mix it up with a little bit of blue, and I'm gonna mix it up with a little bit of black and maybe a little bit of white. When you use a palette knife, you are gonna go through a lot more paint than you would if you were just using a paintbrush. So some people have to, kind of keep that in mind if you're really conservative about, preserving your paint. Maybe you prefer to start with a paintbrush. So now I'm taking two colors while they're wet, and I'm going to kind of mix them on my palette. On my paper is what I meant to say. Now down here in this corner, do you see this little area here that I'm pointing to? It kind of looks like a shoulder. I like to put that in my painting so I still see it. I don't want it to completely go away, but you are the artist and you get to decide what you do with your painting. So now I'm just kind of dabbing, and I'm also spreading similar to a cake. If I was icing a cake, kind of spreading around that icing. So in this case, you're using paint. Try not to just use the colors that come straight out of the tubes in your pack. Try to utilize mixing and making and creating new interesting colors. That's a big part of painting, is learning to use the colors that are available to you and make them work for you. Now I'm working with a little bit of red violet and mixing it in with my violet or my purple. And if I'm not liking what I see, what if I want more detail? Maybe I want to see lines in there. Watch what I can do with my palette knife. I'm also using this, and be careful because this can rip your paper. I'm also creating texture with my palette knife. I'm like scratching the surface. And if I don't like it, I just smooth it out. In drawing class, we talk a lot about hatching and cross-hatching as a way to show value in a drawing. Well, that applies to painting too. So if you know what I'm talking about already, you've used that technique. If you don't know what hatching is, it's lines. Or cross-hatching, lines that cross. So in this case, I'm just using the edge of my palette knife to create some lines. One misconception about painting is that as soon as you apply your paint, that it must be perfect. Paint is meant to be layered. Acrylic paint is meant to be layered. What I have on here is going to get covered up and adjusted again and again. If you are one of those painters who happens to, put paint on your picture and you love it right away, wonderful. But typically with acrylic paint, you're building up your paint. You're building up the pigment and making it so that you are adjusting it as you go. So it's not expected to be perfect that first time around. What if I want to use a palette knife and a paintbrush? No problem. For people who do contouring in the morning with their makeup, kind of think of this like a foundation and how you apply your foundation in the morning with a little bit of a dab, 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 or making dots in areas where you're getting ready to rub it in. I understand these concepts don't apply to everybody in here, but for some of us, it's a really good way to think about how to paint, is that you're actually already doing something very similar to painting in the morning when you're getting ready. So right now I'm working on those cheekbones, or the areas around my cheekbones, and I'm just playing with my palette knife, blending and moving and applying color. Right now I'm working with my cool colors with a little splash of red in there. Keep in mind that when you are learning to understand paint, you want to keep in mind color schemes. The first color scheme you learned was cool and warm colors. Those color schemes were created to help you understand what goes together, what looks right, what doesn't look right. I went in a little too far with my palette knife, no problem. I lost a little bit of the cheekbone up here. That's okay. You can always adjust that. Keep in mind that when you are painting with your paintbrush, with acrylic paint, when you are finished with your underpainting, at this stage you want very little water in your brush. So if your brush is really wet, I like to take my bristles and I kind of squeeze them out with my 2 fingers and pull any excess water out of them so that so I don't have a whole lot of water in my brush. I'm just going to bring that cheekbone back in that I painted over because I don't want to lose it. I want to be able to still see it. So I'm just going in and bringing that back in. And while I have my paintbrush out, I'm just going to fine tune this little area where I have shadows. Again, the concept with acrylic paint is that you are applying it thick, as opposed to watercolor paints or for an underpainting where you are using a watered down translucent paint. You are trying to create an opaque painting, meaning we cannot see through the paint. I also want you to try to avoid doing those eyelashes until the very end. Bless you. I've created some lines with or brush strokes that are all going away from the face. This is another thing that I'm doing intentionally to create texture. When you use a palette knife or even a paintbrush, and when you're working abstract, it is okay to see your paintbrushes. Whereas in later paintings that we will work with, I will be encouraging you to not show paint strokes. Brush strokes is what I meant to say, sorry. So keep in mind that when you're working with abstract, lines and details that include texture are a good thing. So some different ways that you can add texture to a painting. You can use the side of your palette knife. You can apply large amount of paints in sort of a design or pattern. In this case, I used long lines. I also apply paint in a dab, similar to a stipple, but where I'm applying paint kind of like in dots. I'm also spreading paint on like I'm icing a cake or putting on makeup. And I'm just playing with my colors, mixing them and trying to create what looks good in my mind. I don't care so much about your end result. I care more about you experimenting. So on my example, I was just applying a thick amount of paint with my paintbrush. If you'd like to see a trick so you understand one way that you can apply paint to your canvas or your paper, I have not a whole lot of paint on my brush, but what I want is all of that paint to come off onto my paper. And I wanted to, instead of it blending, I wanted to be kind of thick. So I'm going to put my brush onto my paper and I'm going to twist it. kind of like I'm wringing it out. And while I do that, I'm pushing all that extra paint off of my brush. So just another way to apply paint in a manner that'll make it look kind of thick. It'll also give you lines. It'll also kind of mix your colors. So I want you to experiment. How can you apply paint to give yourself texture? How can you apply paint to give yourself, to mix your colors? As I move to the areas where I have a lot more highlights, I'm going to begin using my white and mix it with my colors. In the picture, you can see a lot more pastel colors in the areas where you see the highlights. So kind of keep that in mind. How are you going to show the highlights in the face?
For 1 second.
Sure.